Nigerians can't wait to get to the end of that proverbial tunnel. Let's bring in economist and development strategist Ekenem Isichei. Thank you so much for joining us on News Night tonight. Well, 4 hours of grilling by the House of Reps. The finance minister, of course, you had also the Central Bank of Nigeria governor having to answer questions as to why Nigeria's economy seems to be tanking on a daily basis. Well, that's on the one hand. But the federal government says on the issue of inflation, for example, that the cost of living lowest in Africa. The central bank says we're doing everything to improve Nigeria's economy. Let's get your thoughts on the direction we should be going, and if the policies in place now, will they take us there?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think as we think through Nigeria's challenges and problems, this is one issue that I believe that involves everyone. The nationals, the subnational, and the agencies. I don't think CBN can solve Nigeria's issues alone. And I don't think the Ministry of Finance can do that alone. I think we need to dig deeper. There's some fundamental issues of why we have a high cost of inflation. There's some fundamental issues around why we are borrowing so much. There's also some fundamental issues around our current debt service levels. So I think getting to the genesis of that will be really, really important. The second thing I want to say is that we also need to look at our level of productivity in Nigeria. Our birth rate is higher than our production rate. That's a red flag. So it means that we need to start thinking about the rate at which babies are being born in Nigeria and what that would mean in terms of social pressures. That means you have to spend more money on social pressures for healthcare and other services. So I think we need to address that issue. The second thing that I want to talk about is productivity. We need to increase our level of productivity. You heard one of the reforms that's talking about, which has to do with agriculture. You must boost agricultural production. If you want to bring the inflation numbers around food down, then you're going to have to increase productivity. That also involves food security, which means people must be allowed to go to their farms and produce from their farms. And there's another element involved in that too, which is supply chains. So the supply chain from farm to access, and then not just access, but then to exports. I always had this philosophy that, it's much easier for us. I would love this situation where I can sit from the comfort of my office or bedroom and just export what I need to export and earn foreign exchange without going to CBN or any other agencies. When we start thinking like that, I think we'll begin to think in the right direction, and I think we would also unlock a lot more opportunities around being a bit more export-driven, that can bring more foreign exchange, and we'll have less reliance on CBN and some of the other agencies.
Yeah. Listening to you now talking about unlocking these, one wonders if these are also tied to two key pods here now. First, looking at power. Because if you talk about driving productivity, we also must talk about power. Someone once said we're still waiting for researchers to corroborate that because there's the lack of electricity, that is why you have more babies, especially in rural areas, because people quickly go back to bed and procreation starts. So we're waiting for the researchers to put their research thing in caps. But how well can we help shore up productivity, especially with what we're dealing with at the moment, the twin problem of security and power?
Every time you put on a generator, the cost of production goes up. So even when global companies or international companies are looking at Nigeria, they think about the fact that once my generator comes up, the cost of production goes up. So we must think in those terms that we need to eliminate that piece that has a cost element to it. When you think about, power, like you rightfully you're emphasizing on, it's the bedrock of any economy. We fly to different economies, and like when you're traveling to other places outside Nigeria, one of the things you admire is the power in those countries. And once
you even take it for granted. You don't even think of it because it's not an issue over there.
Yeah, you land in an airport, whether it's in Frankfurt or Addis Ababa, the lights are everywhere, right? It's also a function of the power being available. But I think, like you rightfully said, the more I like to say that we need to scale down our energy access down to the last mile. We have to think about the last mile, the people in the rural communities. How do we get energy to those people? Because they need power too. And they will pay for that power as long as they see there's a benefit to that power. If I know that I'm going to get some level of power, then I don't have to spend money on diesel or fuel to power my, which obviously increases my cost of production. Thinking that that level will definitely help us out in that way. So I think that there's solutions out there.
Right.
There are alternative energy sources that people are already looking at. God has given us the beautiful sunlight we have. I think we need to explore that. It helps to reduce the cost of production. Two, I think when we're doing our policy of driving reforms, think about the last mile. How do we get down to the last mile? Because most of our population are not in the urban areas, they're in the rural areas. So we have to start thinking along those lines too.
And it brings in focus, and it brings in focus the subnational. I want to do a spatiate more on that, because every time we talk about issues like this, we talk about the national government, we talk about the federal government, and I think it sits pretty well for the subnational, because they just hide under that as if they're not. They don't owe the people anything. So when we talk about the rural communities, how best can the subnational help shore up or work in tandem? Because it can start from the grassroots, as you highlighted, and it comes back to the states.
The subnational governments have a role to play. They have a budget. They're also trying to see how they can shore up revenue, internet-generated revenue, which they can use locally, right? So I think they have a really strong role to play. And the highlight with this, they're almost like the first line of contact between them and those in the rural communities. So they have a huge role to play. So, and in thinking about Nigeria's problem, like we kind of talked about earlier, it's not just the federal government who has a strong role to play. The subnational have a stronger role to play. They have full autonomy. They have down to the LGAs. So the question is, when this money comes into the hands of government at the subnational, what do they do with it? So there has to be some level of communication to say, this is what we're going to do with the money. And also, if the governor has a vision or what they call a manifesto, we want to see it being followed through. I think Nigerians are pretty easy to understand. If you explain to them why we have certain reforms, if you explain to them the benefit of these reforms, if you explain to them that short term this could be uncomfortable, I think they would understand. Because we're quite easy.
Yeah, and they also want to see leadership by example and not see profligacy at government level. Let's come back to the issue of the cost of living crisis and the protests that have greeted this in recent times. There was one in Niger State, in Kano, and who knows where next. Now, President Tinubu has waded in, saying, look, there needs to be an emergency in place, emergency food intervention, open the food, reserves and what have you. I recall speaking with a food expert the other day, and he said, look, there's nothing in our food reserves because they were actually depleted during COVID-19, that he's not sure they've, put back that much, in the food reserves. Immediate solution, you'd say that would be, but what are the long-term policies that need to be in place? For all of this really to begin to, improve?
I think for the government, I think it's a good start. I mean, you have to, the fact that it's almost coming down to a state of emergency is a good start. Bringing everybody to the table to begin to talk about Nigeria's issues, especially around food production, I think that's a good start. So we must applaud the government on that level. But we shouldn't rest on the fact that just going to the warehouse to get food to give to Nigerians will solve the issues. Because once we eat the food, what's next, right?
We'll get hungry
what's
again.
next? We'll get hungry again. So we really we have to go back to the farms. We have to make sure that, are we boosting productivity at the farms? Because, every state in Nigeria has a unique terrain. We need to explore that to the fullest and take that God-given resource and even export that.
Yes,
so I think
sorry to cut you there, because we have a breaking story, so I will quickly just go in there and we'll continue. Well, after a 13-day stay in Paris, France, President Bola Tinubu has returned to Nigeria from his private visit, as you can see in that video.
Yes, indeed. Well, the president, who departed Abuja on January 24, was welcomed at the Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport right here in Abuja moments ago by top government officials. His return to the country comes amid rising concerns over the cost of living, fueled by protests in some states. Well, we'll say welcome back, Mr. President. There's a lot on your table, definitely. Let's bring it back to Ekenem Isichei. Well, the president is back, and he's going to have to tackle the cost of living crisis. But it's not something you put out like you're putting out a fire. Long-term measures need to be in place. I ask again, what are the long-term measures that must be addressed? We heard from the central bank governor that, look, in 10 years, Nigerians actually spent $40 billion on education and health care abroad. Now that's depleting our forex on the one hand. What do we need to do about all of this?
I think Nigeria's problem is you can't solve it with a magic wand. But as people of faith, I think the first thing is we just have to have faith that things will definitely get better. If you look
if you don't plant seeds in the ground, don't expect any harvest.
Rain only matters to those who plant seeds in the ground. So the president has an 8-point agenda. And when you look into it, one of the key elements is around agricultural production. We have to think through how do we scale this. And I keep emphasizing because at the end of the day, everyone has to eat.
Right.
What is the biggest cost factor to a Nigerian is food. So we must think through, number one, how do we boost agricultural production? Number two, how do we manage our inflationary issues? So I think what the CBN is doing around having a targeted inflationary framework is helping.
Yeah, CBN is saying 21% in 2024.
Yes, from 28%.
From 28%.
So I think it's possible as long as we follow through with those reforms. I like to say also from a sustainability point of view is there's a big thing that we sometimes miss is called communication. There has to be a strong communication channel down to the last mile of why we're doing what we're doing. Because when you ask the taxi driver or the bus driver, they don't really understand why we're doing what we're doing. So those are just 3 elements there. Then I think the fourth one is what we mentioned earlier, is that we must have a plan around power. Right. Once you have power, I believe you have life. Yeah. And once you have that, everything else would fall in place. Every every society that has some level of productivity has a strong, system around power. Reliability of power, utilization of power, and development of power. Every strong society also has a strong base around human capital. How do we make sure that we harness the human capital we have in Nigeria? The third thing I would say is how do we raise domestic utilization? So how do we show up more domestic capital? If I can get the unbanked to be banked, then for any banking institution, that would increase some level of savings, which is capital, which can be further used for investments. So I think we must have a strong I call it domestic, call it mobilization policy, not necessarily by taxes. Just give people a reason why they need to take their money from the ground and put it into a bank. You know what I mean?
We'll have to say thank you very much. Ekenem Isichei is an economist and development strategist. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.